preach the second message now in a series called The Theology of Creation. It's 6 messages, and here's the outline of what we're covering in these 6 sermons. Last week, creation and the Creator. Today, the history of creation, and in the following weeks, things about the creation of mankind, some evidence for creation, irrational faith in evolution, and consequences of belief systems. Our focus today is on the history of creation, answering questions like, how was the world created? What's happened to the world since creation? What's going to happen to the world in the end? And our message today has these 4 main points, starting with in the beginning, and that's what brings us to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. The Bible begins by telling us this. I'm looking at the very first sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let's understand this. At the start, only God existed. God is the one who created everything else. So God existed, and then He created everything, that is the heavens and the earth, and He created it completely out of nothing. There's a phrase that appears sometimes in Christian theology, and that is ex nihilo, a Latin term which means out of nothing. Sometimes you'll see something where it will say, well, God created ex nihilo, and you wonder, what does that mean? It means that He created everything out of nothing. And that's what the Bible teaches us that God did. It describes His creation as being purposeful, which is in contrast with the idea of evolution. The idea of evolution is that everything was random, it was chance, it was without design. The Bible teaches the direct opposite of that. The Bible says that God did it, as I say, with clear purpose and with a specific order and time frame. And we see something about that order and time frame in the verses that follow. Starting in verse 3, for example. It says, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. God saw the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Here we see that there is the succession of evening followed by morning. Each of these is listed as a day, and on day 1, God creates light and darkness and divides the light from the darkness. On day 2, we see in verses 6 through 8, that God creates sky and sea. Let's take a look. And God said, verse 6, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening, there was morning, the second day. Let's listen now. Here God tells us that it was His work that took waters and put them above the sky. Now, this is something you're not familiar with now. It's going to tell us later why that isn't this way now. But a whole lot of water, an expanse of water, a tent of water, a canopy of water above the sky. God takes waters and puts them up above that, giving something of a greenhouse effect around the world. And then there's the sky. And then below that, below the sky, there is more water, what you would think of as being water at the level of the sea. And so, if you picture this, when you were a kid and you drew with your blue crayon, there would be something where you draw the sky, and right at the top of the page, you draw a little bit of sky at the very top. You know what I'm talking about? Well, and then there would be a lot of white underneath that. In this case, what it's describing is something where there's a lot of water at the top, and then there's sky in the middle, and then there's water below. And God has made this on day 2, the sea and the sky. Day 3, coming to verse 11 and following, we get to land and plants. Then the Lord said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, trees in the land that bear fruit and seed in it according to the various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and morning the third day. To summarize, God makes the land distinct from water, with plants and trees, able to bear fruit, able to produce more plants. That's day 3. Day 4, the sun and the moon and the stars. God said, verse 14, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and then let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. Understand this. He puts the sun there to bring light, but He also puts the sun there and the moon there and so on to mark the change of seasons and the change of years. and we follow after the moon and the sun in these matters. Lights in the sky mark the passage of time and the passage of years and so forth. And then we come to verse 20 and day 5. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the waters teem according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So now we have the creation on day 5 of sea creatures, all that swim and fly. Well, sea creatures and birds. Sea creatures swim, birds fly, able to reproduce, it says, and teem with life. This is day 5. Day 6, starting in verse 24. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. Livestock, creatures that move along the ground, wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Moving on, God said, verse 26, let us make a man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Animals living on land made on day 6. Mankind made in God's image, made on day 6. More about the creation of mankind next week when we focus on that exclusively in this message. But here we see what happens on day 6, and now day 7. Starting in chapter 2 and verse 2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he'd been doing, so on the 7th day he rested from all his work, and God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating he had done. God sets an example for us. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest, a pattern that he himself initiated, a divine pattern for the week. And I will give you just sort of a comment. All the other things that we have in terms of standard kinds of time period, days are measured by things of light and dark and the sun and the earth, right? Months tend to be in keeping with lunar schedules. Years in keeping with traveling all the way around the sun and all the passing of season-related distance. But weeks. The 7-day week, not because of any celestial thing, but because of what God did in 6 days and then the 7th day. And he says, this is the pattern I've established for you to follow. There have been occasions when some folks, particularly ones who wanted to consciously reject what God had done, said, we're going to reestablish something different. And in some communist plans, they said, we're going to set up a 10-day week. And you're going to work for 9 days and get a day off. It would be so much more wonderful. Why the productivity would be greater because you'd be fewer days off. And they found that the productivity went down. People have tried other kind of work weeks. I know of people in some socialist countries who said, well, we're going to do the opposite. We'll work just for a few days and have lots of days off and so on. And people's happiness went down. It's an amazing thing. God says, this is the standard that I've set for you. Follow after this. And I think it's interesting that it's not anything someone would see by looking at the sun or looking at the moon. It's something that you gain from looking at what God did. So all of this is what we see at creation. 6 days, God creates, and then a 7th day. Somebody will ask, and I can explain why in a minute, but somebody will ask, well, how long were these days, these 6 days of creation? The word day, as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, is the word yom, Y-O-M, the word yom, and that word is the Hebrew word for day. And in most cases, it ordinarily means a 24-hour day. There are a few cases, even in Scripture, where it could be used for something that's at an age or a time period, sort of the way we use this in English, where you'll find older people who will say this. This is what Grammy will say. Well, back in my day, we never did it that way. And in that case, she's not referring to a 24-hour day she specifically remembers, but in her time period, back when she remembers when things were different. And so people will do this sometimes. They'll say, back in my day. And as a result, some have wondered, could these 6 days of creation be referring to long general time spans, each day being thousands of years, millions of years? It's just a way of referring to an age. And the answer to that is maybe, but the context here strongly works against it. Notice this, and I had always wondered, as a child I would read this and say, God did this on day 1, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. And I thought, well, yeah, well, days have morning and night, and why do we need to be reminded of this? In fact, he doesn't do this just once for day one, he does this with each one of them. Ordinarily, God anticipates what kind of troubles people are going to get into in their thinking centuries or millennia ahead. And so God intentionally puts here on every single one of those days, it was evening and it was morning, in order to give us an idea of what he's talking about here. And says, I want you to understand I'm talking about morning and evening, I'm talking about a day. And as a child, I was confused about why it was that we had to reiterate that. It seemed sort of obvious. But there's a reason that God tells us this. Why is this all important? Well, it's because of this. Evolution theory postulates long periods of time. I think you know this. Partly because there's no real evidence for the kind of changes that evolution is suggesting, where something that isn't life may become life, and something that is life may change into other life, and one kind of creature will change into another kind of creature. I'm not talking about something that's a modest change from a dog with a bigger nose to a littler nose. I'm talking about something where a dog becomes a horse, becomes something else. There's nothing of this nature that we see happening now, and we don't have any evidence of it ever having happened. And so it's thought, well, since we don't have any evidence in the fossil record or anywhere else that things happen this way, perhaps the way that we can understand this is it happened over a long period of time. And then it makes it seem more believable that it could have happened, even though there isn't evidence of it happening now. And so a long period of time is postulated. And so there are estimates ranging from hundreds of millions of years to billions of years about how long this might have taken to all come about. The evolutionists themselves admitted in a number of their writings that the reason that they postulated these long periods of time and worked up a theory of evolution in its present form, the reason that they came up with this was in order to eliminate the idea of God from the discussion of the origins of the world. A man named Julius Huxley, one of the great philosophers of his age, said that he was thrilled about the theory of evolution because for the first time now we were taking God out of the discussion about the origins of the world. That was very, very important in this case. So, evolution says it was random, and it happened over a long period of time, and then that became standard teaching in many settings. Some Christians, listen now, some Christians have sought to reconcile evolution and creation, evolution and Genesis, saying, well, there must be some way we can put the two of them together and make this work. And there have been a number of theories that Christians have had to try to do that. And my point in all this, firstly, is not to be argumentative with any such Christian, to be divisive with any such Christian. But I do want you, first of all, especially young people, to know that I and others are aware that such theories are out there. I don't want you to someday have somebody mention this. You say, wow, no one ever thought of this before. Put the two of them together. This is terrific. This is an idea that's been floating around, and there are a number of ways that people attempt to reconcile the two. I'll mention something to you. One of them is the so-called day-age theory. And again, it says, well, God created in 6 days, as it described. I believe that from the Bible, but I also believe that evolution is right. And the way I'm going to put the two together is I'll just say, each day was a long time. Each day was a million years. Each day was 100 million years. Each day was a million years. Each day was a long time. And then we get the idea that evolution can be right and the Bible can be right. We'll kind of put the two of them together. I would say about this, well, perhaps, but a couple of things don't persuade me personally. One of them is that the text itself speaks of evening and morning, the way we talked about before. It's hard to reconcile the evening and morning part with millions of years. That's a formula that the Bible uses for a typical day. And also something else. I'm going to go back just for a minute here on my screen. Here it is, there. I want you to notice something. You see on day 3, what is made on day 3? Land and plants. Land and plants. God makes all the plant life, the trees and the seed-bearing fruits and so forth. What is made on day 4? The sun. Okay. Now, if I go out and plant something one day, and the next day the sun comes out and shines, that works pretty well. If I go out and plant something one day, and millions of years later the sun comes out, it doesn't work so well. The whole thing falls apart for me on this point. I don't see how the Bible is describing something where there's a millions of years gap, even in the order that the Bible gives us for how God created. Now, I will tell you, this doesn't, in and of itself, prove or disprove evolution, but it does make it very difficult to reconcile the Genesis account with evolution and say they're both true at the same moment. You understand where I'm going with this? All right. Let's try another one. There's the so-called gap theory. The gap theory is an idea that says that in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there was a huge period of time. Notice Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I will just summarize the gap theory very quickly. It says God made the heavens and the earth, and then there was a jillion years that followed, right after verse 1, in which time, and this is what the gap theory teaches, is that God made an entire world, and demons and others did bad things, and there was animal life and a lot of stuff, and God destroyed that whole world. And then he created yet another different world, and that brings us to verse 2. And the reason that this is attractive to some is they say, well, where do all the fossils come from? All the old fossils were from some ancient time that predated our time, and that must have been another world that we don't know about, but we're going to put it in between those two verses. It isn't something that the Bible anywhere teaches. It's not something that either here or somewhere else we get a hint of another world was created in another way. And in fact, Jesus and the apostles describe all of this and don't teach us this. So it doesn't seem to fit in with anything that's in the Bible. And what's more, if our concern is why do we have all the fossils, I'm going to show you in just a little bit that the flood and all of what happened at the time of the flood appears to me to be adequate explanation of how we have a whole lot of fossils in certain kinds of rock layers, and that seems to be a much better and biblical explanation of how this took place than a lost world in between two verses. There's theistic evolution, and this idea is similar to what we already talked about with that day-age theory. Let me go back to where we were a moment ago. But it really emphasizes that all of Darwin's evolution is true. All of it happened with that kind of seeming random and chance and so on, but at some key moments, maybe at the very beginning and maybe again when God stepped in and made man, at some key moments, God guided the process, and so he deserves credit as the creator, but all of it happened according to the randomness and the chance, for the most part, of evolution. I think there's a couple of things that strike against this in my mind. The very first of it, which is even the premise behind it all. The Bible teaches us, listen now, the Bible teaches that God was a creator creating with a purpose and a design. And evolution teaches us that everything happened by great chance and randomness, and the two philosophies don't easily merge together. You can see that. What is more, as time has gone on, Darwinism is falling apart even with Darwinists. The main reason it's been falling apart is that it was assumed by Darwin that in time they would find lots of fossils of one kind of an animal changing into another kind of animal. We were sort of in between two things. So we would find lizards turning into birds, and we would find certain kinds of fish growing legs and turning into things that we call on land. You understand what I'm talking about? And you'd say, well, that was the in-between stage. It took a few million years or even 2,000 years, but eventually they grew more and more of these appendages and became something different. Today, after 150 years of intense archaeological, scientific, digging up stuff, they haven't found it. There's nothing of the sort. There's no evidence of anything like this. And so at last, in the last decade or two, the scientists have said that idea of Darwinism, where everything just sort of morphed from one thing to another, didn't happen, I don't think. What probably happened instead is that something was a lizard or something like that, and without there being any fossil record and without there being any time period, it leapt into becoming a bird all at once, like this. And so there was an idea about punctiliar evolution, where it goes from this to this, bam, bam, real fast. The reason that this is being thought of now is because there's no evidence for what Darwinism claimed. And so now they would say, with a leap of faith that says, we don't really know that this is true, but it has to be because we don't have a better idea. This is what must have happened. Also, when they're challenged about, if you trace it back far enough, where did the original life forms come from that took these leaps? At this point, the idea that's being seriously floated by the Darwinist crowd is it came from space aliens. And so at this point, I would say there's an awful lot of faith that it takes to believe that space aliens brought life, and at moments that are not found in the fossil record, it took these leaps from thing to thing. And it seems simpler to me to say I have a different faith in something that actually follows the fossil record more clearly. But I don't see any great reason for me to try to merge Christian faith with historic Darwinism and say that I am a theistic evolutionist, because that evolutionary theory is falling apart. And finally, a last kind of reconciliation of the two would be Genesis as symbolism. And this is something that you mainly find in literary circles. If you go to college somewhere, what you will find, I found this at U of M, and you're going to find this if you go to many secular colleges and many Christian colleges, they will have a professor in the literature department, or perhaps a professor in the Bible department who will say, the Bible here is not really describing history. The Bible here isn't really telling us what is truth. Instead, it's trying to tell us what is sort of poetic and what is beautiful. And what we have here in Genesis is a poetic description of something, but we don't want to treat this as being historical. Do you understand what I just said? It may be poetic, it may be allegorical, it may be symbolic, it will be something along these lines, and I could give you 12 different ideas that different professors have had, and there are many, many more, and each one has its own nuances of this, but that's the way it's being presented. I'll just tell you one thing about this. When people would come to Jesus and ask questions about marriage, he would say, this is what it says in Genesis at the creation. When they would come to him and ask him questions about God's work and things, he said, this is the way that God made things. And he didn't say, well, you know, that was all symbolic. He's saying, this is what happened. When the apostles speak of what happened at the beginning, they say, this is what took place at the beginning, and they say, this was the truth. They don't say, well, that was symbolic. That was poetic. So that's kind of an explanation runs against what Jesus and the apostles taught about our own faith. Was Jesus wrong? Were the apostles wrong? If that's the case, well, then the whole Christian faith falls in on itself, and it's difficult to reconcile Christianity with evolution along those grounds, in my opinion. Now, I mention this all to you just so you know that there are these ideas out there, and that you will hear them. You'll go to some place, and it's a literature class here, and it is a Bible class there, and someone will teach these things. You'll say, wow, this is amazing. I never thought of this. We can easily slide the two together. It's not so easy as that after all. I tell you, there are many attempts to make the Bible agree with Darwinian evolution, and they're unsuccessful attempts, I think. There may be some people here who think differently, and I've got to admit there are a lot of things about all this that I don't know. I wasn't there when God made it. I do have His Word. There's things about science that I always defer to Mr. Boyer or someone smarter than I when it comes to this. But I can tell you this, and this is something that helps me. When people say, well, Pastor Paul, you've got to understand that for us to get all that we have around us, maybe it's stars, and the light that's coming to us from stars, maybe it's something else, it's something that looks like it's been around for a long time. It has to have been a long time. Something that is of some help to me and might be of help to you is the fact that when I read in Genesis, it talks about God creating the first man, and when He created the first man, that first man was fully formed as an adult man. Do you understand that? And so, in this case, rather than saying, well, He'll create a few cells, and then the man will grow up, and over the course of 30 years he'll become a complete man, He is a complete man at the start. We know that the first woman He created was created as a fully grown woman at the start. And it appears to me that the trees that He creates and the other vegetation He creates are created as mature creation from the start. And so God is able to make a mature creation of all things, whether it's people or stars or anything around us, as a mature creation. God is certainly capable of doing that, and we don't need to think, well, He could not have done this, so it could not have happened in so many days. That doesn't strike me as being persuasive. The thing that I can tell you with certainty, and this will end the first part of our message, is the Bible says, and we can affirm again, in the beginning, God created. And then we come to the second part of our message about sin entering the world. If we're talking about how the world was made, well, what happened next? What affected the creation? What brought us to the point where we are now? And the next thing that was really crucial is that sin entered the world. And that was not the way it was at first. Please notice that at every step of creation, up until this point, God had said it was, in his view, very good. I even have this reiterated for you. God saw that the light was good, verse 4. And God saw that it was good, verse 10. And God saw that it was good, verse 12. And God saw that it was good, verse 18. And God saw that it was good, verse 21. And God saw that it was good, verse 25. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good, we see in verse 31. Does everyone understand this so far? The creation that God makes, everything is perfect. And nothing is at odds with anything at all. It's just perfect. And then something happened that for the first time was not good. The man and the woman disobeyed God's instructions intentionally. It tells us about this in chapter 3. We'll just note this quickly. The serpent, speaking on behalf of Satan, comes to the woman Eve and says to her, "Did God really say this to you?" And she begins to reason with him. And the serpent says to her in verse 4, "You will not die." You know, what God said isn't true. For God knows, verse 5, that when you eat of it, if it's fruit that God had told you not to, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Pause here for a moment. The Bible teaches us that there were certain commandments that God had given them. And among those commandments was, here is something that I do not want you to eat. They disobeyed God. The significance of this is primarily in the idea that they disobeyed God, identifying the specific kind of fruit and why God didn't want to do it and so on. We can get into that and come up with some good things, but the most important thing is God said, "Don't do this," and they did. For the first time, something in his creation didn't act as it was supposed to be, and this brings sin, and it brings a cascading fall. First of all, Adam and Eve falling away and hiding themselves from each other and hiding themselves from God. A little later, God approaches them, and they're hiding, and they don't want anything to do with him, and eventually they're driven out of the garden in shame, and from that point onward, everything began to go wrong in their own lives in certain ways. It brought eventual death to them. It brought sin into the lives of their children. Each of their children inherited such sin. The sin was passed on from generation to generation all the way down to you and to me. One of their children murdered another of their children. Do you understand? Creation was changed. And not only about people was creation changed, but it goes deeper than that. It affected everything else. It affected animals. I can tell you this, that I had a dog when I was young, and my dog would disobey, and my dog would fight with other dogs, and creation was not perfect in the same way. Do you understand this? I love my dog, and I love my children, but my children disobey. And there have been moments when they haven't been in great agreement with each other. Do you understand? It affects more than just people. It affects the animals, and it actually affects all of creation. The physical features of our world are different as well as a result of this. The Bible tells us that we live now in a fallen world. And I'm going to just outline a couple of things about this. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, that is, sin came through Adam and his sin, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sinned. It's telling us so far that every one of us inherited this sin from the original sinner, and all of us have this sin. It's a change. This happened through one man, Adam. And by the way, this is just sort of an aside, everyone listen. It doesn't say here, sin came through other means, and allegorically, symbolically, poetically, it was described that it came through Adam. It instead says, through the Apostle Paul, it came to us through this one man. The facts of this as being historic or being proposed to us. And a little later it says, for if by the trespass of one man, because of what one man did to sin, Adam, death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and of the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? Now it's telling us that one man brought sin. One man who is his successor will do the opposite and bring life to those who believe in him, that is, Jesus Christ. And that there's an historical reality to both. There's an historical reality to the first man of sin, and an historical reality to Jesus Christ who brings us eternal life. Sin brings about that, the original sin brings about that kind of trouble to all people, and also brings all of creation under a curse, so it was no longer very good. The same book of Romans that we're citing tells us some things about creation. It uses these expressions, for the creation is subjected to frustration. It said not only did sin come into people's hearts, but all of creation is now subjected to frustration, meaning that the way that it's supposed to function doesn't function the way it's supposed to any longer. Something is amiss. What kinds of things are amiss? Earthquakes, and tornadoes, and famines, and disasters, and things that God didn't originally design and say, this is very good. These things happen now. Does everybody follow me on this? Subject to frustration. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, it says, groaning under the weight of sin, waiting for it to be restored to something that is pure and right again. At the very end of this message, we're going to hear about how God will at one time make this creation right again. But for right now, all of creation is groaning and struggling under the weight of such sin. This means we live in a fallen world. People die. Animals die. I mentioned earthquakes and tornadoes that kill. There's famines and floods that destroy. Even on good days, there's still pain. There's illness. There's broken relationships. There are things that are lost and broken. There's hatred. There's sin. It affects every part of creation. There's an important implication in all of this. Everyone hear this. Creation was pure and perfect until sin entered the world, and now it groans with trouble and death. This understanding makes it more likely that the world was created rapidly in short days of creation, as described in Genesis 1. I'll tell you why. If everything evolved over hundreds of millions of years, what we'd be talking about is that there was a little life form, and it went along a little distance, and then it produced some other things and it died. And some other things were produced and then they died. And some other things were produced and they died. And some other things were produced and they died. And over the course of hundreds of millions of years, lots and lots of things were evolving and dying. And more things died, and more things died, and more things died. And then there were certain humanoid types that were similar to people, but weren't quite yet people, and they all died, and eventually we came to somebody who was the first person. You with me on this so far? That would be what you'd have in a prolonged theistic evolution, where you say, well, God started the ball rolling, and then there was all this death, and then eventually we come to Adam and Eve. But the Bible says at each stage along the way, at every step along the way, not just when Adam and Eve were created, but all the way from all the steps, all those days leading up to it, God looked at it all and said, this is perfect. This is very good. This is just the way I want it to be. And the Bible describes death as being an end. And what God would say was very, very good. And so in the graph we have here, it's picturing this idea of millions of years of pain, death, killing, disease, struggle, suffering, and extinction. And saying that this all predates God's creation of man, and that seems very, very unlikely scripturally. This makes it more difficult, as I say, to mix the Bible and evolutionary theory. The thought that sin has changed this world after the time of Adam is what the Bible teaches us instead. And that brings us to a third part of our message, where we find out something else that changed the world in a substantial or dramatic way. The earth was changed still further by a flood, as described in Genesis, starting in chapter 6. And we can look there and we'll see a few verses as we go quickly through this. It was a worldwide flood, covered the tops of the mountains, and later changed the features of the world in powerful ways. Let's see what the purpose of the flood was. We can go to chapter 6 and verse 11. Genesis 6, starting at verse 11, says, Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and was full of violence. By this time, there are people that have spread out around different parts of the world. And it says it had become very, very corrupt, full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. God speaks to one of his chief men, Noah, and says, I'm going to bring an end to the world in its present condition because of the sin in the earth. I'm going to end this, and that's why I'm bringing such a flood. It's judgment on the earth. God is going to start over again with a righteous man, Noah. And so an ark was created, and then the next verses ahead, it describes the proportions and the materials the ark was made from. One of the things I can tell you is the ark is a very long and somewhat slender box-like thing that has the same proportions that ocean-going tankers and other sort of ships like that have today. When you see pictures in children's storybooks, there's this thing that looks sort of like a half circle, and there's a little box on top of her house, and there's a few giraffes sticking their necks up and so forth. That's not what the Bible describes. And so think of something that is much, 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 much larger than that, the size of ocean-going ships today, and is, interestingly, the same proportions in length and width as ocean-going ships today. This is something that, if primitive people were thinking of sort of a fanciful story, they would come up with something different that wouldn't work. Instead, this is something that exactly fits the proportions that does work. And so it teaches us something right there. The Bible says that from this ark, Noah and animals were preserved, and that he and his family survived, while the rest of the world was destroyed. A few things about this that are of interest to me. If you study into it, you will find that cultures virtually everywhere in the world have a memory of and stories of an ancestor who was preserved through a flood that covered the world and that preserved the human race. There are some folks who will say, well, sure, but maybe each of them are remembering a different local flood, and they just remember there was a flood in the past, and they remember a story about this. And maybe, except for a couple of things. One thing is this, that some of the places that have these kinds of stories are people who live in deserts. And they don't have flooding, and they don't have that kind of background, and yet they still have the story. And also, in general, they have a sort of story very similar, where it's a man and his family, and it's a small thing that is then saving everyone. It's not something that's way different from the story. It lends us the idea that this is something that goes all the way back to something that all peoples trace their origins back to. And that it appears very strongly that we're looking at a worldwide flood that everyone has now descended from the same original people, Noah and his family. What is it specifically that happened? Well, we can look at chapter 7 and verse 11. It tells us in verse 11, partway through the verse, having mentioned what day and month and year, it says, on that day, the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Several key things. The first says, the springs of the great deep burst open, or burst forth. Apparently, there were underground caverns filled with a lot of water, the springs of the great deep, and all of that comes rushing upward to flood the earth. Now, a lot of water below the world, all of it's coming up. But also a lot of water above the world. You remember we described the kind of a canopy of water that was above everything, above the sky. And that now is burst, and it all comes down over the course of the next 40 days in torrents. And the greenhouse effect there once was is ended. And the whole world is different from that point on. When people do a little digging around in Antarctica and Alaska and elsewhere, it's common that they find something that is evidence of tropical stuff. And I don't know everything there is to know about this, but it appears to me that when you have a greenhouse type effect and everything is relatively temperate and warm, you can have all kinds of tropical things. And when you burst that, you're now going to have hotter days and colder nights and more variations of temperature and a lot of things. It's going to be a different world than it was before. And that's what we see. What is more, when you have that much water taking pressure on things, the pressure is going to be intense. And it's going to cause some things, perhaps there's a lid that is on this underground cavern, and then crashing in, the water fills that. Now there's seismic activity with earthquakes everywhere. There's activity with the earthquakes bringing about volcanic activity, and volcanoes are going off, and there's more things things shaking on this world. I know just a little bit about this. I grew up in a seismic area, and there would be earthquakes, and occasionally with really, really big earthquakes. You can have something where it wasn't a harbor, crashes in, and now there's a harbor. You have other places where there used to be mountains and buildings, and it all falls apart and looks different. And that's with a localized earthquake. If we have something with worldwide pressure from that much water, it is going to change everything dramatically. What eventually happened to all this water? It fills in the oceans, some of which sank and crashed in, and then it pushed other things up, and the mountain ranges go up, and things go down, and the whole world ends up being shaped somewhat different, and the climate is somewhat different, and everything looks and seems different after such a flood than what it was beforehand. What is more, the kind of water rushing everywhere and receding and having all of these dead things from the effect of the flood leaves a lot of rapidly forming fossils of the bones of dead things. Did you understand what I just said? You've got a lot of dead things, and it all ends up in fossil layers. Some of these layers happen very, very quickly. Now, I realize that scientists will say, if we look at this fossil layer, no doubt that's millions of years, and the next little layer, millions of years, and the next little layer, millions of years. I'll tell you a little more about why they say that in a few minutes. I can tell you, and we'll see this too, that these things can form very, very fast, especially under flooding type conditions, especially under a worldwide flooding condition, and that appears to us to be what happens because of Noah's flood. Let's move on. I'm going to think with you for just a minute about this question of rock layers forming slowly or quickly. And I'm going to refer to an expert here. My son Timothy made a science project recently, and in thinking about how long some of these rock layers would take, again, someone might say, well, these formed over the course of millions of years and so on. There's a problem with that if you go some of those theories. One of them is this, that there's many times that there are fossils that span multiple rock layers. Do you understand what I just said? One thing ends up being where we're told that it was millions of years up to this line, and it was millions of years up to this line, and it was millions of years up to this line. It's one fossil right through the whole business. Like this. Here we have various rock layers. That thing up the middle is a fossilized tree. Now, I can be pretty sure that the tree didn't start there and have the bottom part of it fossilized and then wait for millions of years, and then another part of it is fossilized and it waits for millions of years, and then another part is fossilized and then more. As far as I can tell, all those rock layers were formed pretty fast, and the tree gets fossilized running perpendicular to the rock layers. Did you understand what I just said? So you have some things like this that give us a pretty fair idea that some of this can and did happen very quickly. Another thing is that a lot of times, as you drive, you don't see this in Michigan much, you drive in Pennsylvania, and you're driving along the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and you see that they've carved the road right through layers and layers and layers of rock. And it's very interesting to see the stratification as you drive along. You know what I'm talking about so far? You see all the different colors, and it's terrific. But what you often see is something where it is bent, like so. And especially with sedimentary rock, you've got something where it just, this dotted line shows the bending of it, where it's not straight, it bends and so on. If this takes millions of years to form, well, then it freezes at a certain point, and then it starts to bend, bend. What's going to happen to this? It will snap, it will break, it will be at jagged angles to each other. If this is going down very quickly and it's muddy, and it continues to conform, it will be able to bend. And notice that we're not just talking about this much that's bending, we're talking about a lot of stuff that's bending. It looks like this all comes down very, very fast. These are examples about the idea of things happening really, really, really slow. Doesn't seem as compelling as the idea that this all went down very, 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 very fast. This is the conflict or the contrast between two ideas. The idea of uniformitarianism, which is a big word, and catastrophism, which is another big word. What do these mean? The first one means that everything is happening in a very uniform way over a long period of time. It used to be believed by geologists that every once in a while there'd be a big catastrophe, and that changed our world, and that was what was thought. In the last 100 years, what is now typical is, a geologist will say, everything has happened in a uniform way. Everything has happened exactly at the same rate. Let me see if I can illustrate this. Mr. Martin, can you stand up first, please? Mr. Martin, how tall are you? Roughly 6'6". Oh. Now, Mr. Martin, can I ask you a personal question? How old are you? 44. All right. Now, under uniformitarianism, what we would say is he is 6'6", and he's 44 years old, and we would take the 6 foot 6 inches, and we would divide it by the 44 years, and we'd find out how many inches he grew every year. Exactly. Do you understand what I just said? Now, I don't know, somebody can do the math for me, but he would, get, an inch or two every year, and we'd say, we know from having seen it right now, he probably grew uniformly for 2 inches each year, and that's what happened. I happen to know, or I can guess, that there was a catastrophe in his life, and he turned 14 and grew 3 feet. Is this true? Okay, yeah. You see, what happens is that we don't grow uniformly. We instead have these moments where something happens and there's a big change. Is this right? And so my view of Mr. Martin is, well, sort of uniform, and then there was probably sort of a catastrophe, and there were things that happened and he changed a lot at certain times. And in recent times, I think he slowed down. Is this true? Okay, that's right. So it's not been uniform in your life. Am I correct? Thank you. So, in the same way, people take a look at something like the Grand Canyon. Here are some people riding some mules and looking at the Grand Canyon. These people are going to be told when they ride the mules down the Grand Canyon that what has happened is the Colorado River has flowed through this canyon for millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years. And every year, there is a part of a centimeter that gets worn away. And there's a part of a centimeter that got worn away over millions and millions and millions of years. And at first, it started out as something where it was a creek you step across, and now look at it. That's what that's uniformitarianism. Did you get this? And as they look at how much is being worn away now, it's not very much. It's a little bit. So they say, well, let's add it all up. This means it took a lot of years to make the Grand Canyon. That's uniformitarianism. Catastrophism says, well, that doesn't seem to us to be the best explanation of this. It looks more likely that the Grand Canyon was cut really quickly in a short period of time. And people say, well, what evidence would you have of that? Well, some of it, again, is things where you've got bent rock layers. Some of it, again, is where you've got fossils that are expanding different things. Some of it, this is interesting to me, and I don't know enough about this, but apparently there's places along the line, and people report this, where the river flows in a direction where at some points it's going uphill. And this is something that it has to do now because there's nowhere else to go. But if it was forming a little bit at a time, just sort of digging down a little bit at a time, it would have taken a different route. But if something is a flash flood and it just all of a sudden has a lot of water to go somewhere all at once, this can happen. Do you understand this? And so there's a bunch of stuff that makes it a whole lot less likely that it all took place and a whole lot more likely that it happened all in one big shebang. I will give you an idea of how we know that something like this can happen. The Earth formations can happen very quickly. I'll give you an idea of this. In the summer of 1980, I drove across western Washington State. And as I drove across western Washington State, it looked like there was gray snow. It was deep, all across everything that I could see along the highway. This was early August. The gray snow was ash from Mount St. Helens, which had just exploded weeks earlier. Mount St. Helens blew up in this way. Part of the mountain fell off, and lava came out, but more importantly, mudslides from liquid of all kinds began to sweep down this mountain. And in a span of hours, as these mudslides came down, bringing whole lakes and other things sweeping down and knocking out stuff, in a span of hours, this canyon was formed. Maybe we call it the Little Grand Canyon. It's much smaller than the Grand Canyon, but it is substantial. In hours, from this one mountain having this one seismic field, it creates this one canyon with a new river flowing down through it today. Today, if you took scientists to it and they didn't know about the history of Mount St. Helens, and you said, how long ago did this take place? In fact, sometimes people will take little samples from this and take it to scientists and say, can you tell me how long ago this was deposited here? He'll be told this was deposited in this form millions and millions of years ago. The fact is that catastrophes, such as the flood, can do an awful lot to change things in a great hurry. And this is one recent example of such that's worth knowing. What best describes our world is a uniformitarianism or catastrophism. And I think that based on scientific evidence and biblical evidence, catastrophism is a better explanation. And that will bring us to the last part of our sermon, and that is what will happen in the future concerning our world. After the flood of Noah's time, God promised he was never again to destroy the earth by flood. That's what he said. He said, I'm not going to ever do this again. That's another reason, biblically speaking, I don't believe the flood was a local occurrence. Some people will tell you, and you will read this even from some Christians, they'll say, well, the flood was a little thing that happened in Mesopotamia or happened in that area, and it really didn't cover the whole world. If God said, I'm never going to let this happen again, have there been some very, very extreme floods in this world since? There have. And so God would in fact be saying, I'm not going to let it happen again, but it did. Instead, God says, I'm never going to let this worldwide judgment before it come. That's not going to happen. And so, God says he's not going to destroy the world again by flooding. Never another worldwide flood. But the world will not go on in its present form forever. I'm going to have you turn with me to 2 Peter chapter 3, and this is where we're going to end our message. A few words from the book of 2 Peter in the New Testament and chapter 3. The Bible here tells us what will happen to the world going into the future. Chapter 3, starting at verse 3. 2 Peter 3:3. 2 Peter 3:3. First of all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They're going to deny that sin and judgment are really real and so on. They're going to say, verse 4, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. This is interesting to me. It says there's going to be scoffers who will come in the last days and say, everything in the past probably looked just like it does now, and nothing changes in any substantial way. They sound to me like uniformitarianists, don't they? They say everything is just the way it is now and always has been. Nothing's ever been different. And it's always going to be the same in the future. There's never going to be any changes. There's going to be no judgments and no catastrophes. Everything is the way we measure it right now. It says this is what scoffers will say in the last days. They will say, where is this coming of Jesus Christ, verse 4? But they deliberately forget, verse 5, that long ago by God's word the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water, so they forgot that God created it all. By these waters, verse 6, also the world that was deluged, that was flooded and destroyed. So the Bible tells us that they forgot that God created the world, and they've forgotten that there was a flood, and they've rejected the idea that there was a worldwide flood. The Bible says this kind of rejection will happen in the last days. Does it sound believable that kind of rejection could happen in the last days? It does. By the same word of God, the same direction of God, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Now it tells us that God has promised not to flood the earth again, but has not promised never to bring destruction, not promised not to bring judgment. Instead, he will bring judgment, but this time the judgment will be by way of fire. That's what the Bible teaches us will happen. And so we look further and see a little more about this. Verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. This fire will destroy at least the surface of the earth and all the elements connected to it, at least that. And moving ahead to verse 12. As you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming, that day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in its heat. And verse 13, but in keeping with this promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. You we have a picture of the earth being destroyed by fire, and the Bible tells us that that will happen. That day is coming. But in verse 13, we are looking forward to something that will follow that, a new creation of a new heaven that is restored to what creation should be, but it is very good. It's no longer going to be under the curse of death. In fact, it tells us about the new heaven and new earth in the book of Revelation. The last 2 chapters of Revelation say that Jesus will be there. There will be no sorrow. There will be no suffering. There will be no death. All the things that weren't there before sin entered this world will not be there again. And all the good things, the fellowship with God, and the righteous things that were there before before sin will be restored. There will be a restoration of all these things in that last day. So in our study today, we have heard something about the history of creation, how the world was originally made, how it was changed by sin, how the flood changed it, what will happen in the future, and how it will be restored again in the future. All of these things are things that we've learned in today's message. And finally, when we come next week, we will hear something about the creation of mankind, and more specifically, at God's creation of people. And that brings us to an end of this message today. I'm going to have the worship folks come forward. I'm going to remind you of something as they do that. Yesterday we had a Creation Day event, and a number of the young people from our church, children, made some poster boards that display something about God's creation or something about evidences of God's creation, and those are placed out in the foyer area today. They came from the Creation Day yesterday to church today, and they're there for you to be able to examine. This is going to be your one chance to examine them. Don't think you'll look at them more next week. They'll be gone. So you can look at them today, and then if those boards are yours, your job today is to take them home. Let's try that again. If they're yours, your job today is to take them home. That's the idea. So we'll take them home after today. But be sure to take a look at them. Even if they're not, take a close look at them. There's some good work that's there. Why don't you all stand together and we'll have a final hymn of praise to God.